Luis Delgado had grease under his fingernails and steel dust in his lungs. For nearly 22 years, he'd shown up at the MotorCore plant in Detroit before sunrise, clocked in without fail, and put in honest work. He wasn't a man of many words, but the clunk of engines and the hiss of pneumatics, those were sounds he understood. They meant routine. They meant stability. They meant life. But on a gray Monday morning in early March, that soundscape was shattered. Delgado office, now, barked a supervisor who'd never even bothered to learn Luis's first name. He was flanked by two men in suits, corporate types. Cold eyes, fake smiles. Luis wiped his hands. On a rag, frowning. Something wrong with the assembly line. No, just come with us. Inside the narrow HR office, Luis was met with the silence of a printed termination letter already lying on the desk. No severance. No explanation. We're restructuring, one suit said flatly. Luis blinked. After 22 years, the other one gave a rehearsed sigh. We appreciate your service. You'll have 30 minutes to gather your things. The hallway on his way out smelled the same oil, sweat, and metal, but it all felt foreign now, as if he'd been erased. No handshake, no goodbye, just a name removed from the system. He didn't say a word until he got home, where his wife Camila waited with a lukewarm cup of coffee and too many questions in her eyes. Luis, why are you back? They let me go, he said, simply. She stared at him. What? Why? No reason. Restructuring. He left out the part where they'd walked him out like a criminal. No man wanted to be seen like that by his wife. That evening, their son Mateo came home late, backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder, a look of unease in his usually sharp eyes. Police came by school, he mumbled as he opened the fridge. Luis stiffened. For what? Some fight. They said I was involved, were you? No, Mateo snapped, more offended than scared. I don't even know the kid they're talking about. Luis looked at his son for a moment. 17, about to graduate, honors student. Always kept his head down. This didn't add up. The next day, a knock came at 6:40 a.m. It wasn't a neighbor. Two police officers stood at the door, stiff and officious. Is Mateo Delgado home? Camila gripped Luis's arm. What is this about? Your son is being taken in for questioning related to an assault at Jefferson High. Luis stepped forward. He didn't do anything. Sir, we need him to come with us. He's not under arrest yet. The word yet landed like a hammer. They didn't let Mateo speak. Didn't let Luis ride with him. He watched his son disappear into the back of a squad car. His reflection twisted in the scratched plastic. By noon, Luis was sitting in the county station's grim waiting room, staring at a coffee machine that hadn't worked in years. Finally, a detective came out. White guy, crew cut to confident. We've got eyewitnesses, he said without even sitting. Your son was seen fleeing the scene. Eyewitnesses lie, Luis said quietly. The detective smirked. We'll let the courts decide that. The court date was set for next month. Mateo was released under supervision, but the charged felony assault hung over the Delgado home like storm clouds. Luis paced the kitchen every night while Camila cried in silence. Mateo withdrew into himself, earbuds constantly in, as if the music could drown out the accusation. But Luis didn't have time to fall apart. He started making calls, talked to old co-workers. A pattern began to emerge. 7 workers laid off the same week, all of them Latinos, all of them with more than 15 years on the line. And then came the detail that made his blood run cold. The key witness in Mateo's case, Officer Travis Mahoney, an off-duty cop with a reputation in the neighborhood, known for aggressive stops, once accused of planting evidence, but cleared by internal review. Luis knew then, this wasn't just about a fight, it was about control, suppression, quieting people who'd outlived their usefulness in the system. Mateo had become a convenient target. One evening, while digging through legal aid flyers at the community center, Luis met Maria Cortez, a retired union organizer who used to work at the plant. They pushed me out 5 years ago, she said, tapping her cane on the tile. Same trick every time, cut the voices that ask questions. She looked at Luis closely. You gonna let them take your boy? Luis shook his head slowly. No, he said. I'm gonna fix this. Luis didn't know how yet, but he knew this much: broken gears didn't fix themselves. Someone had to get their hands dirty, and Luis Delgado had never been afraid of grease. It had been 10 days since Mateo came home with a court date stapled to his name. Like a scarlet letter, Luis tried to return to routine cleaning tools he no longer used, flipping through old mechanic catalogs like they still meant something. But nothing felt normal. The house echoed differently. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed like it was holding its breath. Mateo had barely spoken since his release. He spent most of his time holed up in his room, headphones in, eyes vacant. When Luis tried to talk to him, all he got were shrugs or single-word answers. You hungry? No. You doing okay? Fine. Fine never really meant fine. Luis finally snapped one night after dinner. He was scrubbing the same plate over and over again, knuckles white, when he turned and faced his son. You're not okay. None of us are. Talk to me, Mio. Mateo looked up from his phone, eyes red not from tears, but from exhaustion, frustration, maybe even fear. They think I'm a criminal, Dad. No matter what I say, they already made up their minds. I'm just another brown kid in a hoodie to them. Luis's chest tightened. He didn't have the words, so he did the only thing he knew. He sat beside his son and let the silence speak. The next morning, Luis returned to the community center. He hadn't been back since his brief conversation with Maria Cortez. This time, he brought a notepad and every document related to Mateo's case he could get his hands on. Maria sat in the corner by the bulletin board, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of her. When she saw Luis, she gave a small nod. You're serious, huh? She said. I have to be. Maria leaned back in her chair, bones creaking louder than the wood. They want you tired. They want you isolated. But when workers organize, when neighbors talk, that's when the cracks start to show. Luis took a deep breath. I'm not a leader. No one is until they have no choice. They went through a list of names, people Maria remembered. From the factory, former union allies, janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers. Most had similar stories. Quiet layoffs, subtle threats, no paper trail. The plant had cleaned house without ever announcing a purge. Luis met with 3 of them that same week: Victor, a welder with a bad hip; Deshawn, a forklift operator with 2 kids in college; and Nina, who worked inventory until the day her ID badge suddenly stopped working. They gathered at Luis's garage, the place he used to fix neighborhood cars. Now it served as a meeting hall, filled with folding chairs and bitter coffee. Y'all feel like this was targeted? Luis asked. Victor snorted. Hell yeah. They cut the old ones, the loud ones, the brown ones. Deshawn nodded. And they brought in temps, no benefits, no rights. What about legal help? Nina asked. Luis opened his notepad. Maria knows someone, a labor rights attorney, pro bono. But it won't be easy. Nothing ever was. Meanwhile, Mateo's court date loomed like a storm cloud. Luis spent every free moment digging, looking for surveillance footage, witness statements, anything that could prove his son's innocence. At the community center, he found an intern named Kayla who had experience filing FOIA requests. Together, they submitted one to the city for body cam footage from Officer Mahoney, the same cop who'd claimed to see Mateo fleeing the scene. You really think they'll give it up? Kayla asked. Skepticism sharpened her voice. Luis shrugged. They have to. It's the law. Kayla gave him a look. So was slavery. Just because it's law doesn't mean it works for us. That night, Luis barely slept. He kept thinking about Kayla's words, about Mateo's silence, about the broken chain that connected the factory, the police, and the system. In his dream, he was back on the line at MotorCore, tightening bolts on a car that wouldn't start. No matter how much he turned the wrench, the engine sputtered and died. When he looked closer, the inside of the machine was hollow, just like justice. 3 days later, the footage came in, grainy, shaky, but clear enough to show what really happened. Officer Mahoney had arrived at the scene 5 minutes after the incident. By then, the fight was over. The kids were gone. In his report, he claimed he'd seen Mateo running from the scene, but the footage showed him standing in front of his car, talking to a teacher. No running, No suspects, just words. Luis stared at the screen. He lied. Kayla nodded. And now you have proof. It wasn't enough to make the charge disappear, but it was enough to start unraveling the narrative. Luis called the attorney Maria recommended a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Angela Price. She'd handled wrongful termination cases, racial profiling suits, and was no stranger to fighting uphill battles. Your son's case smells like bullshit, she said. After reviewing the file, and if the cop lied, we can subpoena more records, but it won't be quick. Luis nodded. I'm in this for the long haul. Angela smiled faintly. Then you better get used to the smell of courtrooms and coffee. By the end of the week, Luis had filed an official complaint against Officer Mahoney. He also submitted documentation for a wrongful termination inquiry against MotorCore, citing discrimination and violation of labor protections. He wasn't naive. He knew the system was designed to protect itself. But now, he wasn't alone. Victor brought in more former workers. Deshaun made flyers. Nina contacted a local podcast. And Mateo finally joined a meeting. He didn't say much, but when he stood up and read a statement about what happened to him, his voice didn't shake. And when he finished, the room was silent. Then someone clapped, then another, and another. It wasn't justice yet, but it was the beginning. Luis looked at his hands that night, rough, stained with rust, callous from decades of labor. He used to think they were only good for fixing machines. Now, he realized they were good for fighting back. Luis remembered a time when the union hauled down on Prescott Avenue, used to buzz with life picket signs stacked like firewood, coffee brewing around the clock, laughter mixed with anger in the air. It had been the soul of the working class. Now it was a vape shop. He stood across the street from it one morning, watching a teenager in a beanie open the doors with a key that once belonged to a man who'd fought to get dental coverage for janitors. History's for sale, he muttered. Sold cheap, too, said Maria, stepping beside him. They were headed to the county clerk's office to file a request for worker grievance records. The plan was to uncover a pattern to show that MotorCore had been quietly dismantling worker protections for years, but the clerk was dismissive. We don't maintain private HR records. You'll need a court order, and even then, good luck. Luis slammed his hands on the counter. So they get to bury everything? The clerk raised an eyebrow. You can always sue. Maria pulled Luis away before things got worse, outside. She handed him a cigarette. Neither of them smoked, but the motion helped. This city was never built for people like us to win, she said. But that doesn't mean we don't fight. The next meeting at the garage had more people than chairs. Word had spread, not just about Mateo's case, but about MotorCore. People had stories, layoffs, health issues, pension funds that vanished overnight. Luis had started recording the meetings just audio for, now in cataloging every testimony. One woman, Rosa, talked about losing her husband to lung disease after years in the factory paint room. They knew it was toxic, she said. Didn't give him a mask. Didn't pay for his hospital bills either. A former electrician named Darnell described how his back injury on the job was mysteriously left out of company records. I walked in tall, he said. Crawled out crooked. They acted like I never existed. Mateo sat in the corner during most of the meetings. He didn't speak, but he listened. His eyes no longer carried that detached fog they were tracking, analyzing. One night, he approached Luis. They've been doing this for years. Luis looked up from a stack of notes. Since before I got hired, I've been thinking, maybe we should film this stuff. Post it. Like a docuseries or something. Luis blinked. A what? Mateo grinned faintly. YouTube, Dad. TikTok. People care more when they see faces. Luis hesitated. Cameras made him uncomfortable. He was from a generation where you solved things with wrenches and elbow grease. But Mateo had a point. All right, he said, let's show him. Within a week, The Broken Clock became a YouTube series. The first episode was raw, just a shaky camera, a black backdrop, and Luis telling his story. I gave 27 years to MotorCore. I trained people. I shut down machines when they sparked. I stayed late. I missed birthdays. And they fired me with a generic letter and a lie. He paused, then added, But this ain't just about me. The views trickled in, then exploded. Local workers started recognizing Luis on the street. Some thanked him, others whispered warnings, "Be careful, these people don't play fair." Angela Price, their attorney, called with updates on Mateo's case. "The footage is useful," she said, "but the DA isn't dropping charges. They're offering a plea deal instead." Luis gripped the phone. A plea for a crime he didn't commit. Lesser charge, no jail. Just probation. But it's still a conviction, Luis told Mateo, expecting an explosion of frustration. But his son sat quietly, then shook his head. "No, I didn't do it. I'm not signing anything." Luis smiled, his heart breaking and swelling at once. "Then we'll fight it." Angela warned them that trials could take months, years, sometimes, especially for young men of color accused of violence. But Luis didn't care. The wheels were turning, and the union, though long dead, was beginning to speak again. The videos brought heat. MotorCore's PR team issued a cold, clean statement. These claims are being exaggerated by a former employee with a personal vendetta. But then came a breakthrough. One of the night supervisors, an older white man named Stan Harrington, reached out to Luis anonymously. They met at a gas station on the edge of town. Stan wore sunglasses and a hoodie. "They're not just firing people, Luis. They're shifting the whole operation offshore. Been planning it for a year." Luis blinked. "That's why they're cutting locals." Stan nodded. "Once they break the benefits contracts and local wages, they move production to Mexico and India. Whole plant's gonna be gone in 18 months. Luis recorded the conversation on Mateo's advice. Stan agreed, as long as his name stayed out of it. "Just tell them," Stan said, "the American dream's being sold in bulk. Clearance aisle." Luis uploaded the video with the title, "Whistleblower Confirms MotorCore Shutdown Plan." It hit 1.2 million views in 3 days. Suddenly, national eyes were on them. News outlets requested interviews. Activists reached out. A few politicians made vague, supportive statements. Nothing concrete. Mateo looked at the comments section, then back at his dad. "We're loud now." Luis felt it too, but he also knew what came next. When you get loud, power pushes back. The push came faster than expected. 3 nights after the video dropped, someone slashed the tires on Luis's truck. No theft, just a message. Angela called again. "They're gonna try to scare you. Maybe hit you with a lawsuit. Retaliation. You ready?" Luis tightened his jaw. "I've got rust on my hands, not fear in my heart." She chuckled. "Then let's get ready for war." And so, in the middle of a city that had forgotten how to protect its laborers, Luis Hernandez, former mechanic, accidental activist, father of a falsely accused boy, stood taller than ever. Not because he had won, but because he had chosen to fight. Luis used to think that losing his job was the loudest thing that would ever happen to him. But silence, intentional, suffocating silence, was far more dangerous. He noticed it everywhere now. The neighbors who used to wave stopped making eye contact. The cashier at the corner store, once cheerful, now rang him up in awkward silence. His cousin Eddie, still working at MotorCore, stopped returning his texts altogether. "They're isolating us," Maria said one evening as she wiped down the counter in Luis's small kitchen. "Divide and conquer. It's an old tactic." Luis nodded. "Same thing they did back when the machinists tried to strike in '91. First came the layoffs, then the rumors, then everyone stopped talking." Mateo, sitting at the table with a laptop full of edited footage, muttered without looking up. "They cut us quietly, so we make noise." The channel had grown. The broken clock now had over 100 subscribers. Luis's voice, once drowned out by machine noise, was now being heard in homes across the country. Comments poured in from mechanics, janitors, line workers, and bus drivers. They told him to keep going, that they saw their own struggles in his story. But popularity came with risk. Angela called to warn him. "There's a defamation claim in the works. MotorCore's legal team is preparing something." Luis exhaled slowly. "So they're not ignoring us anymore." "Exactly. They want to freeze you, scare you into silence." "What happens if they sue?" "They won't win," she said. "But they don't have to. They just want to drain your time, your money, your fight. Luis rubbed his temple. He wasn't made of stone. He was tired, but he couldn't back down, not now. Not when people were watching. Not when Mateo's case still hung in the balance. Angela had also received discovery documents related to the case, internal police memos, witness statements, surveillance summaries. "Luis," she said during their call, "I found something." He tensed. "What?" The arresting officer, Detective Nash, he had multiple complaints of excessive force, all buried, all before Mateo's case. Luis didn't say anything. He simply closed his eyes and sat down slowly, as if the news had weight. Angela continued, "And the convenience store that provided the footage. Their manager was pressured into releasing a selective cut. The original full footage that's missing. Mateo, who had been listening from the hallway, stepped in. So they doctored the tape." Angela sighed. "I can't prove it yet, but it's clear something's off." Luis returned to the garage meetings with new urgency. Attendance had doubled again. They were no longer just sharing stories. Now they were organizing. Rosa was coordinating a day of protest outside MotorCore HQ. Darnell was building a timeline of all factory injuries over the last decade. Mateo had started a podcast version of the channel featuring interviews with former employees. The movement was spreading. And then it happened. One morning, Maria burst into Luis's apartment with a folded newspaper in hand. Front page. She said breathlessly, "You made it." The Cincinnati Herald had published an expose. Local giant, MotorCore, accused of systemic labor violations. Luis stared at the headline, then at the picture of himself standing in front of the locked factory gates. Beneath the image, the subheading read, "Mechanic turned activist fights back against corporate silence." The spotlight changed. Everything. By that afternoon, MotorCore had released an internal memo warning current employees against unauthorized public statements. Anonymous sources sent Luis a copy. It was full of veiled threats, references to disciplinary action, contractual consequences, and behavioral guidelines. Mateo printed it, taped it to the wall behind their next video shoot, and pointed at it on camera. "This," he said, "is fear, and this is how it looks when a company knows the truth is coming." But then, something unexpected happened. A group of retirees, old MotorCore workers from the 80s and 90s, showed up at the garage. One of them, a frail man in a brown leather jacket, stepped forward and introduced himself. "Name's Robert Hayes. Worked the line for 38 years. Built more gearboxes than I can count." He looked around the room, his voice shaky, but full of intent. "I saw your videos. Reminds me of the union days, of what we used to fight for. Thought it was all gone. But maybe it's waking back up." The retirees joined the cause. They brought old records, old photos, documents long forgotten in dusty filing cabinets. Evidence. Proof. Luis sat at the edge of the room, watching these older men, some with canes, some with oxygen tanks, arguing fiercely about policy, contracts, and justice. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Then came the retaliation. Mateo was walking home from the community center when a car pulled up beside him. Two men in plain clothes stepped out. "Hey, you Mateo?" one asked. "Who's asking?" The man smiled without warmth. "Friends of the company. Just wanted to talk." Mateo stepped back. "I've got nothing to say." Before he could react, one of the men shoved him hard into a chain-link fence. No punches, no overt violence, just a warning. They drove off laughing. When Mateo came home, his knuckles were scraped and his jaw was tight. Luis froze. "What happened?" "Company friends," Mateo said hi. Luis's hands shook with rage, but Mateo put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not scared, Dad." "Not anymore." Angela filed a formal complaint with local authorities. She also contacted a journalist at a national investigative outlet. "They tried to intimidate your son," she told them. "Now it's your story, too." The journalist bit. Soon, a national spotlight turned its beam on MotorCore. Reporters showed up at HQ. The CEO released a generic statement. "We are committed to ethical labor practices and deny any wrongdoing." But the damage had begun. whispers of a federal investigation started swirling. That night, Luis sat alone in the garage after everyone had gone home. Rain tapped against the corrugated roof. He looked at the grease-stained floor, the shelves lined with old tools, the walls covered in posters, clippings, and protest signs. He thought of his father, who died with arthritis from decades of wrench-turning, of Rose's husband, who never made it past 55, of Mateo, still carrying bruises but standing tall. He picked up an old wrench, the handle smooth from years of use, and stared at it like it was a relic from a past life. Then he whispered to himself, "They built this city on our backs. It's time we remind them we're still here." Courtrooms were never built for people like Luis Mendoza. He sat stiffly in a worn, creaking pew near the front, beside Angela, watching the fluorescent lights flicker above the stained ceiling panels. It was early morning, the kind where everything feels like it's holding its breath. The air was sterile, recycled, almost accusatory. Mateo's trial had officially begun. The charges hadn't changed: assault of a law enforcement officer, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, the same three-line indictment that had followed him like a curse for nearly a year now. But something had changed, something big. There were cameras this time, real ones. National outlets had picked up the story. Mechanic's son faces charges in controversial arrest. Angela had given background briefings. Civil rights attorneys had shown interest. And behind Luis, a full bench of former workers and community members filled every available seat, their silent presence louder than any shout. But Luis couldn't focus on any of that. His eyes never left Mateo. Mateo wore a navy suit borrowed from a friend of a friend. He sat upright, jaw clenched, hands folded. His bruises had long faded, but the stiffness in his posture said they were still there. The prosecutor was a polished man named Troy Kensley, Harvard Law, corporate smile. He spoken, measured tones, calculated pauses, the kind that made everyday decency sound suspicious. "This case," Kensley said to the jury, "is not about labor disputes. It's not about politics. It's about respect for the law." Luis leaned forward, nostrils flaring. Kensley continued. "The defendant, Mateo Mendoza, chose to escalate a lawful stop. He pushed. He shouted. He struck an officer." Angela whispered beside Luis, "They're laying the groundwork." Emotional framing. No mention of the missing footage. Luis didn't answer. He just stared at the man behind the lie. Angela's turn came the next day. She rose like a storm wrapped in silk. Calm voice, sharp eyes, steel spine. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what you're about to witness isn't just a trial. It's a reflection. A mirror held up to a city that forgot who it serves." She walked slowly past the jurors. "My client is not on trial alone. The truth is. And the truth is simple. He was stopped without cause, assaulted, and arrested to send a message not just to him, but to every worker who dares speak out." Then she dropped the first bomb. "We have proof that key body cam footage is missing." The courtroom murmured. The judge tapped his gavel. Angela turned toward the gallery. "You'll hear testimony from a former MotorCore security analyst. You'll see time-stamped gaps in footage. You'll hear from a whistleblower who saw the original video before it vanished." Kensley objected. "Speculation." The judge frowned. "Let the defense proceed for now." Luis felt something shift then. Not big, not dramatic, but real. It was the sound of the truth cracking the walls. The trial stretched for days. Witnesses were called. The arresting officer, Detective Nash, testified in a tight, clipped tone. He was aggressive. Nash claimed, raised his voice, "Refused to comply. When I went to detain him, he shoved me. I followed procedure." Angela approached the bench calmly. "Detective Nash, are you aware that your department has received 7 excessive force complaints against you?" Objection sustained. Angela continued anyway, pivoting. "Are you aware that the security footage from the store where the incident occurred is incomplete?" Nash hesitated. I can't speak to that. Because it's not your job, or because it would contradict your report." Objection sustained. But the seed was planted. Then came their strongest witness, Jasmine Wallace, a former IT contractor at MotorCore. She was nervous, fidgety, but when she took the stand and looked Mateo in the eyes, something hardened in her. "I saw the original video," she said, "the one from the store cameras. It showed the kid backing up, hands raised. He didn't shove anyone. The officer grabbed him." Angela approached gently. "And what happened to that footage?" "I flagged it in the system. Next day, I was locked out. A new final version appeared, shorter, edited. Then I was told my contract had ended." Luis watched the jury. They leaned forward. They were listening now. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew. Former employees held signs with phrases like, "We built the machines that built this city. Justice for Mateo. Our blood oils their gears." Media vans lined the sidewalks. Hashtags were trending. Luis was no longer just a father fighting for his son. He was the face of something much larger, a reckoning. But victories don't come easy. The prosecution struck back with character attacks. They pulled up Mateo's teenage suspension for fighting in school. They brought up graffiti he'd tagged. During the 2020 protests, they painted him as a patterned agitator. Angela fought back with, "Clean facts. My client was 15. He served detention. He grew up. He chose to build, not break." Still, the damage lingered. Luis spent sleepless nights wondering, is this what justice looks like in America? A resume of your worst mistakes, replayed louder than your best intentions? The closing arguments came like thunderclaps. Kensley stood tall, voice booming. "We cannot tolerate violence against our officers. If we erode that respect, we erode the very foundation of law." Angela stood shorter, firmer. Her voice didn't boom, but it burned. "You want to talk about foundations? Let's talk about whose backs this system is built on. My client didn't erode anything, he exposed it. Exposed the silence, the missing footage, the buried complaints, the fear." She looked the jury in the eye. Mateo Mendoza didn't assault justice. He was trying to survive it. The jury deliberated for hours. Luis sat in the waiting room, holding Maria's hand, staring at a vending machine without seeing it. Mateo paced. "What if they convict me? We appeal," Angela said. "And if we lose that?" Luis turned to his son, grabbed both his shoulders. "Then, we keep fighting, because this trial isn't just about you anymore. It never was." Finally, the jury filed in. The courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood. In the matter of People versus Mateo Mendoza, on the charge of assaulting a law enforcement officer, we find the defendant, a breath held, not guilty. Luis collapsed back in his seat, eyes wide, lungs catching air like it was the first breath he'd taken all year. Maria covered her mouth. Mateo blinked in disbelief. The next two charges followed. Not guilty, not guilty. Mateo hugged his father so tight it cracked Luce's ribs. They didn't care. Neither did anyone else. Applause broke out in the gallery. Despite the judge's warnings, the people had won a single battle, but the war was still ahead. That night, back in the garage, Luis looked around at the crowd of workers, students, retirees, and journalists all gathered under one roof. "This isn't over," he told them. Mateo walked free, yes. But how many haven't? How many are still inside because someone wanted to teach them a lesson? He paused, eyes scanning the room. They call it justice, but we know it's just the system. And now, it knows we see it. They erupted into cheers, but Luis didn't smile, because deep inside, he knew the broken clock might have ticked once, but it still needed fixing. The verdict had been read, the cameras had flashed, the headlines were loud, but the silence that followed was even louder. Luis Mendoza stood in the middle of his garage again, though the ownership was still unofficial, and stared at the massive pile of letters on his workbench. Some were support notes, some were job offers, others were threats. He didn't care much for any of them. What he cared about was the notice taped to his front gate that morning. City of Milton Building Inspection Report. Notice of code violation. Failure to comply within 15 days. Will result in demolition. Angela read it over his shoulder. They're going after the building. Now, Luis gave a humorless laugh. Of course they are. When they can't kill the man, they kill his home. The garage was more than just a workspace. It had become a symbol, a gathering place, a small rebellion that smelled of grease and coffee. Workers from across the city passed through bringing broken engines and broken stories. Young kids came to learn how to fix carburetors and ask about justice. News crews filmed from the sidewalk now. They weren't allowed inside. That part still belonged to Luis. Mateo was back, too quieter, more focused, still dealing with the emotional wreckage of the trial. Sometimes Luis caught him staring off into nothing, hands twitching like they wanted to punch something but didn't know what. Angela tried to talk him through it. You beat the charges. Mateo, you're free. I'm not free, he'd replied. I'm famous. MotorCore had gone silent. No press statements. No acknowledgments. No offers to settle the dozens of wrongful termination suits that had begun piling up since the trial. But things were moving behind the scenes. Luis could feel it. One of the fired engineers, a man named Hal, showed up late one night. He looked over his shoulder 3 times before entering. I shouldn't be here, he said, voice low. Then why are you? Luis asked. Hal pulled out a folder from his coat. Because I saw something. Inside the folder were internal memos, company emails marked confidential. They discussed protest organizers by name. They referenced security camera manipulation. They even mentioned Luis directly. Make sure Mendoza doesn't become a martyr, Angela read aloud, eyes narrowing. They weren't just reacting to the unrest. They were planning containment. Hal leaned in. They've been coordinating with the city council, trying to fast-track zoning changes. Their goal is to erase this block and rebuild it into a tech corridor. Luis looked around his garage, the chipped paint, the crooked light fixtures, the handwritten signs, and the faces of the people fixing things in the back. They want to pave over a grave, he muttered. Days passed. Then the fire came. It was 3:17 a.m. when Luis was jolted awake by sirens. Smoke billowed into the sky like a warning. The fire trucks were already there, hoses fighting orange flames that swallowed the edge of the block. An old warehouse next to the garage. Mateo stood outside, barefoot, shivering. I saw them before it started. Who? 2 men in MotorCore uniforms, just walking away. The firefighters called it an electrical accident. The police called it a coincidence. Angela didn't say anything. She just looked tired. Luis stared at the warehouse, at the walls where his friends had once stored tools, where workers once organized picket lines, now reduced to ash. Coincidence? Sure. The next city council meeting was standing room only. Luis stood at the podium, flanked by Angela and Mateo, looking out at a room filled with politicians in suits and residents in T-shirts. The garage isn't just a building, Luis said. It's a piece of our history. It's a place where people found purpose. And you want to bulldoze it so tech executives can have valet parking. Councilman Reed, MotorCore's favorite puppet, folded his hands smugly. Mr. Mendoza, with all due respect, your building is a safety hazard. Luis held up the inspection report Angela had analyzed. This is fraudulent. The supposed violations don't even match the building's architecture. You never even inspected it. You just want it gone. Another council member raised an eyebrow. Then prove it. File an injunction. Take us to court. Angela stepped forward. We already did. The paperwork went in this morning. That wiped the smug off Reed's face. The next few weeks were war. Paperwork battles, fundraisers, permits challenged, media interviews. Angela gave speeches while Luis fixed trucks in the background. Mateo started working with local youth groups, teaching them how to repair engines and how to recognize when they were being manipulated. The block around the garage changed. What was once decay became color. Murals appeared overnight. One wall bore a towering image of Luis holding a wrench, surrounded by flames. The words, "We bend metal, not knees." Someone posted it online. It went viral. They called it the Resistance Garage. But resistance has a cost. One morning, Luis found his truck tires slashed. Another day, a brick came through the garage window. No note, just silence. Mateo wanted to fight back. Let's organize marches again. Let's push harder. Luis shook his head. No, they want us angry. They want us loud. We fight by building. That's what scares them. But it's not working. Luis put a hand on his son's shoulder. It is. That's why they're attacking. Then the letter came from a whistleblower inside City Hall, anonymously dropped under the garage door. It was a draft agreement, a secret memorandum between the city and MotorCore. Demolish and rezone the block. In exchange, donations, development incentives, and a seat at the council's economic board. Luis looked at Angela. This is the blueprint, the whole deal. Angela nodded. This is how we bury them. And just like that, the silence broke. This time, not with smoke, but with fire of a different kind. Luis stepped back in front of the cameras, not as a victim, not as a mechanic, but as a voice that couldn't be shut down anymore. They tried to take our jobs, then our dignity, then our homes, and when that didn't work, they tried to take our story. But we're still here, still standing, still fixing. And the city, this time, listen, ... They came in suits ... Not police, not inspectors, but private security in midnight blue jackets, sunglasses and earpieces, for black SUVs parked across the street. They didn't say a word, didn't make threats, didn't touch anything. They just stood there, watching ... Luis stood at the garage entrance with Mateo and Angela by his side. He felt the eyes of the neighborhood behind him, mothers, veterans, students, all silent, all present. What are they doing? Mateo whispered. Angela narrowed her eyes, waiting for us to blink. A week ago, Luis had held a press conference on the sidewalk outside the garage. He'd shown the whistleblower memo to every reporter willing to listen. The story spread like a virus, city officials selling out their own people for tech lobby money. The mayor's office tried to deny, then deflect, then went radio silent. Within 48 hours, two council members had resigned. MotorCore issued a statement claiming no knowledge of rezoning initiatives. But behind the scenes, Luis knew the gears of retaliation were already turning. The demolition orders were now frozen, the lawsuit pending, but the eyes watching them from across the street, they were the real message. We're not done with you. The garage had become something bigger now. The Resistance Garage wasn't just a nickname, it was a movement. Chapters popped up in other cities, Chicago, Detroit, Oakland. They weren't all garages. Some were barbershops, diners, co-ops, all places where working-class people gathered to talk, learn, resist. People donated. Volunteer lawyers offered time. A local architect came to restore the garage's facade, pro bono. Even celebrities started posting about it. But fame made Luis uncomfortable. I didn't do this to be known, he said. Angela replied, you didn't. You did this to be heard. That night, Luis couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy. He walked alone to the back of the garage, past the old oil drums and stacked tires. There was something nostalgic about it all, like the smell of metal had memories embedded in it. He thought about his father, a quiet man with strong hands and tired eyes. He'd taught Luis everything: how to fix an alternator, how to sharpen a chisel, how to stay calm when the world pushed back. He used to say, a man's not measured by what he builds, but by what still stands after they try to tear it down. Luis sat on an overturned bucket and wept for the first time in years. Not from fear, not from anger, but from the weight of it all. 3 days later, the hearing began. The courtroom was packed: activists, reporters, city residents. The case, Mendoza et al. V. City of Milton and MotorCore Industries. Angela stood before the judge, calm and exact, reciting every clause of zoning fraud, backroom dealing, and retaliatory behavior. Her voice was steady, but her words struck like thunder. MotorCore's attorneys looked robotic, rehearsed, bloodless. They argued that the city had a right to develop, that the garage was a relic, that Luis Mendoza was emotionally compromised. The judge listened and asked one question: did you or did you not attempt to bypass proper demolition procedures to fast-track development? The silence in response said everything. Outside, chants echoed, fix our streets, not silence our shops. We are the gears. We won't grind down. The night after the hearing, someone spray-painted a message across the sidewalk. In front of the garage, this is what community looks like. Luis left it there. The ruling came a week later, in favor of Mendoza. The city was ordered to halt all rezoning plans on the block. MotorCore was fined and placed under federal review. More importantly, the court recognized the garage as a historic site of cultural significance protected under state law. Angela broke into tears when the judge read the verdict. Mateo just stared at his father and whispered, "We did it." But Luis shook his head. "No, they did it." Victory didn't mean peace. The black SUVs disappeared, but the whispers didn't. Rumors of MotorCore lobbying for a federal exemption surfaced. Private investors began sniffing around the area, offering money to struggling residents. Gentrification had a new face, now friendlier, better dressed, but no less hungry. Luis responded the only way he knew how, by fixing. He expanded the garage's programs, opened a weekend class for single mothers, hired returning citizens, men and women just released from prison, teaching them skills they could trade. He hosted town hall meetings, helped people read housing contracts, used the garage as a shield. One afternoon, months later, as the garage buzzed with activity, a teenage girl named Kira approached Luis. She wore a torn hoodie, her backpack frayed. She held up a letter. "I need help," she said. "My landlord's trying to evict my grandma. Says he's selling the house to a developer." Luis glanced at the name on the paper, a familiar one, MotorCore Development Group. He looked at Kira, then at the faces inside the garage, people laughing, arguing, sweating under cars. He knew what came next. "Let's fix it," he said. That evening, Luis found Mateo sitting on the roof, legs hanging off the edge, looking at the skyline. "You okay?" he asked. Mateo nodded slowly. "I thought winning would feel bigger." Luis sat beside him. "Sometimes winning just means you get to keep fighting." A long pause. Then, "Do you ever wish you hadn't started this?" Luis looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, still carrying the grime of his trade. "I wish I didn't have to," he said. "But I'd do it again. 100 times." Mateo leaned against his father's shoulder. For the first time in years, there was peace between them, not perfect, not whole, but real. The next morning, Luis arrived early at the garage. The sun was just peeking over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. He turned on the lights, poured himself a coffee, and walked over to the oldest workbench in the shop. The wood was cracked, stained with decades of labor. In the center was a small plaque, "Just installed, to those who hold the line when the world tries to erase it." Luis ran his fingers over the metal. Then he reached for his wrench and got back to work. The end.